They said the house had been empty for years. And yet, more than once, those who passed by in the late hours were certain they had seen a light shift behind the curtains, as though someone had only just stepped out of the room. No one had ever seen the door open, and no one could say who might have been inside. Tonight, you will follow another account from the records of Edmund Blackwood, where the quiet details of an ordinary street concealed something far less certain. What first appeared to be a simple rumor of a neglected house soon revealed itself as one of the more peculiar cases I had the opportunity to observe, where presence was never proven, yet could not be denied. The street itself did not invite attention. It lay slightly removed from the busier parts of London, where movement never truly ceased, and instead existed in that quieter space between necessity and neglect. The houses stood in a uniform row, their facades marked not by disrepair, but by a kind of stillness that suggested long familiarity with the passing of time. It was the sort of place one might walk through without ever committing it to memory, a place that did not demand to be noticed. And yet, one house within that row had begun, in its own quiet way, to resist being overlooked. The first mention of it came not as a formal report, but as a passing remark, the kind that might easily be dismissed if not for the tone in which it was given. There had been, it was said, a light, not constant, but present at irregular intervals, visible only briefly, as though it belonged to a room no one occupied for long. The curtains, drawn but not fully closed, allowed just enough of a glow to be seen from the street, though never long enough for anyone to be certain of what they had observed. Such accounts, on their own, would not have warranted further attention. In a city as large as London, it is not uncommon for small irregularities to take on a life of their own, shaped more by suggestion than by fact. A flicker of light becomes a pattern, a shadow becomes a presence, and in time, a story forms where none existed before. What distinguished this case was not the report itself, but the consistency with which it returned. Different individuals, at different times, described the same impression. The house, though believed to be empty, did not behave as one would expect of an abandoned place. There were moments, brief, uncertain, but repeated, in which it appeared occupied, not in the sense of habitation, but of recent presence. The kind of presence that leaves no lasting trace, yet cannot be entirely dismissed. It was this detail that drew Edmund's attention. When I was first informed that Edmund Blackwood intended to visit the location, there was no indication that the matter held any urgency. There had been no crime reported, no evidence of intrusion, and no clear sign that anything within the house had changed. Yet it was precisely this absence of change, combined with the repeated suggestion of activity, that seemed to interest him. We arrived in the early evening, at an hour when the street had not yet settled into night, but had already begun to withdraw from the day. The light was fading, though not entirely gone, leaving the outlines of the buildings clear, if somewhat softened. There was no movement to distinguish one house from another, no sound that suggested interruption. The house in question stood no differently from the rest. Its windows were intact, its door closed, its exterior unmarked by any sign of forced entry or neglect beyond what might be expected of a place left unused. There was no visible indication that anything within it had changed, no trace of disturbance that might suggest recent activity. And yet, as I regarded it more closely, there was a subtle impression that did not align with its apparent stillness. It did not feel abandoned. Such impressions are difficult to define, and often unreliable when taken alone. They arise not from observation, but from the absence of something expected, a detail that should be present, but is not. In this case, it was the quality of the windows, not their condition, but the way they reflected the fading light. They did not carry the dullness one might associate with long disuse, but a faint clarity, as though they had been, at some point not far removed, cleaned or touched. Edmund did not remark upon this directly, yet his attention lingered in a manner that suggested it had not gone unnoticed. We approached the house without haste, the quiet of the street remaining undisturbed by our presence. The door, when examined, showed no sign of recent use, Yet neither did it bear the marks of neglect that might have accumulated over years of abandonment. The handle, though still, did not carry the dull residue of disuse. It retained a faint sheen, subtle enough to escape notice unless observed with care. This detail, like the others, did not stand as evidence in itself. It did not prove entry, nor did it confirm presence. It existed only as a contradiction, a small deviation from expectation that, when considered alone, held little meaning, but when placed alongside the others, began to suggest a pattern. The air around the house carried a stillness that was not entirely natural. It was not the quiet of emptiness, but something more contained, as though whatever lay within the walls did not extend beyond them. Even the faint sounds of the street seemed to diminish as they approached, not in absence, but in restraint. Edmund Blackwood regarded the house for some time before taking a step closer. There was no hesitation in his movement, yet neither was there any indication that he expected immediate revelation. His method, as always, relied on patience, on allowing the space to present itself before attempting to interpret it. When at last he reached the door, his attention moved not to the lock, but to the frame, tracing the edges where would met stone, where small imperfections might reveal themselves. There was nothing obvious, no mark that could be pointed to as evidence of entry. And yet, the same quiet inconsistency remained. The house, though said to be empty, did not carry the signs of having been left behind. As I stood there, observing both the place and the manner in which Edmund considered it, I became aware of the subtle shift that had already begun to take hold of the case. What had first been presented as a simple irregularity, a light seen where no light should be, had already begun to take on a different form. It was no longer a question of whether the house was empty. It was a question of how something could pass through it without ever remaining. The decision to enter the house was not made with any sense of urgency, but rather as a natural continuation of what had already been observed. There had been no clear evidence of intrusion, no indication that anything within required immediate attention, yet the quiet inconsistencies surrounding the place made it difficult to leave the matter unresolved. The house did not present itself as abandoned, nor did it behave as one that was occupied in any ordinary sense. It existed somewhere between those two states, and it was within that uncertainty that Edmund chose to proceed. The door, when opened, offered no resistance beyond what might be expected of a structure long left unused. The air within was still, carrying neither the sharpness of neglect nor the familiarity of habitation. Instead, it held a neutral quality, as though it had been disturbed only briefly and then allowed to settle once more. There was no immediate sign of recent activity, no sound, no movement, nothing that might confirm the presence that had been suggested from outside. And yet, the absence itself did not resolve the matter. The interior of the house revealed a space that had been left in a condition of quiet order. Furniture remained in place, though not arranged with any particular care. Surfaces bore a thin layer of dust, but not one that suggested long abandonment. It was uneven in its distribution, settled more heavily in some areas, lighter in others, as though certain parts of the room had been disturbed without leaving a clear trace of how or when. Edmund Blackwood moved through the space with the same measured attention that had guided his earlier observations. His focus did not rest on any single object, but on the relation between them, on how each element aligned with the others, and where that alignment failed. The room, when taken as a whole, appeared undisturbed. It was only when examined in parts that the subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. The floor, in particular, offered a detail that was not immediately apparent. The dust that had settled upon it remained largely intact, forming a faint and continuous layer that spoke of time passing without interruption. Yet near the center of the room, there was a slight variation, not a footprint, nor a clear mark, but a disturbance so faint that it could not be defined as movement in the usual sense. It suggested contact without direction, as though something had passed through the space without leaving a path. This detail, though uncertain, did not stand alone. Similar irregularities appeared along the edges of the furniture, where the settled dust showed signs of having been brushed lightly, not removed, but altered. These were not the marks of regular use, nor of deliberate cleaning. They lacked the consistency of intention, appearing instead as the result of brief and isolated contact. The windows, viewed from within, presented another subtle contradiction. Their glass, though not recently cleaned, retained a clarity that did not align with prolonged neglect. There were no streaks, no heavy accumulation of residue, only a faint dullness that suggested intermittent attention. It was not the condition of a place entirely forgotten, but of one that had been, at some point, maintained just enough to avoid deterioration. Edmund did not speak, yet his attention lingered on these details in a way that suggested they were being placed within a larger structure. It was not enough to observe that something was out of place. The question was whether these irregularities could exist together without contradiction, whether they formed a pattern that pointed toward a single explanation. As we moved further into the house, the same quiet consistency remained. Each room reflected the same balance between stillness and subtle disturbance, offering no clear indication of recent presence, yet refusing to align with the expectations of abandonment. The absence of sound, of movement, of any direct evidence did not resolve the matter, but rather reinforced its ambiguity. It became increasingly apparent that the house was not being used in a conventional manner. There were no signs of habitation, no indication that anyone lived within its walls, yet neither was it entirely untouched. The disturbances were too deliberate to be dismissed, yet too incomplete to be understood as ordinary activity. The idea began to take shape that the house was not occupied, but visited, not regularly, and not for extended periods, but in brief intervals, each one leaving behind only the faintest indication that it had occurred. These visits, whatever their purpose, did not alter the space in any lasting way. They did not introduce new objects, nor remove existing ones. They existed only in the subtle shift between what was expected and what was observed. Edmund Blackwood paused near the center of the room, his attention drawn not to any single detail, but to the space as a whole. There was a stillness in his manner that suggested recognition, not of a conclusion, but of direction. The house, though quiet, had begun to reveal its nature, not through what it contained, but through what it lacked. It lacked continuity. The disturbances, though present, did not form a pattern of regular use. They appeared, then ceased, leaving no trace of progression. Each one existed in isolation, disconnected from the others, as though the presence that caused them did not remain long enough to establish itself. As I considered this, it became clear that the case did not concern a hidden occupant, nor a forgotten residence. It pointed instead toward something more deliberate, a use of space that relied not on permanence, but on absence. The house was not empty. It was simply never occupied long enough to prove otherwise. The impression that the house was visited rather than occupied did not resolve the matter, but it provided a direction that had previously been absent. What had first appeared as a contradiction now suggested a pattern, though one that did not conform to ordinary habits of use. The disturbances within the rooms, the condition of the surfaces, and the absence of continuity all pointed toward a presence that was both deliberate and restrained. Edmund did not treat this as a conclusion, but as a foundation upon which further observation might be built. The question was no longer whether someone entered the house, but how often and for what purpose. Such questions rarely yield immediate answers, yet they often reveal themselves through repetition, through the accumulation of small details that, over time, begin to form a consistent structure. The house, when considered in this light, appeared less as a place of residence and more as a point within a larger sequence. It was not meant to sustain life within its walls, but to serve a function that required only brief presence. The absence of personal items, of any indication that someone remained, supported this understanding. There were no belongings to suggest identity, no objects that might link the space to a particular individual. Everything within it existed in a state of quiet neutrality. This neutrality, however, was not without meaning. A place that contains nothing can be used by anyone. The idea, once formed, began to align with the earlier observations. The irregular disturbances, the lack of continuity, and the faint signs of recent contact all suggested a use that did not rely on permanence. The house did not belong to someone in the usual sense. It was a space that could be entered, used, and left without leaving behind anything that might identify its visitor. Such spaces are not uncommon in a city as large as London, though they are rarely recognized for what they are. They exist between ownership and abandonment, overlooked precisely because they do not demand attention. Their value lies not in what they contain, but in what they allow. Edmund Blackwood moved through the remaining rooms with the same measured attention, confirming that the pattern observed in the first space extended throughout the house. There were no signs of habitation, no indication that anyone had remained long enough to establish a presence. Each room reflected the same balance between stillness and subtle disturbance, reinforcing the idea that whatever activity occurred within the house was brief and controlled. The upper floor revealed nothing that altered this understanding, though it provided a clearer sense of how the space had been maintained. The dust, though present, had not accumulated to the degree one might expect over years of disuse. It suggested that the house had not been entirely forgotten, but had been, at intervals, disturbed just enough to prevent the natural progression of neglect. This detail, though minor, carried significance. A place that is left entirely and used deteriorates in predictable ways. Dust thickens, surfaces dull, and the air itself begins to change. None of these conditions were fully present here. The house had been left untouched, but not entirely. It existed in a state that required occasional interaction, though not enough to establish continuity. As we descended once more to the lower level, Edmund's attention returned to the entrance. The door, like the interior, showed no clear sign of repeated use, yet neither did it reflect long neglect. The handle, the frame, the threshold, each carried the same subtle contradiction, appearing both unused and not entirely abandoned. It was at this point that the possibility of multiple individuals began to take form. If the house had been used by a single person, even intermittently, some form of consistency might have emerged. A pattern of movement, a preference for certain areas, a gradual shift in the arrangement of objects. These are the marks of repeated use by one individual. Here, no such pattern existed. The disturbances were too varied, too inconsistent to belong to a single source. This suggested that the house was not visited by one, but by several. Not together, and not in any regular sequence, but at different times, each visit independent of the others. The space did not reflect a shared presence, but a series of isolated interactions, each one brief enough to avoid leaving a lasting impression. The implication of this understanding extended beyond the house itself. A place that can be used by multiple individuals without leaving trace serves a purpose that goes beyond convenience. It becomes a point of transition, a location where actions can occur without connection, where one event does not lead directly to another. It allows for separation not only of time, but of identity. Edmund did not state this directly, yet the direction of his attention made it clear that the house was no longer being considered in isolation. It had become part of a larger system, one that extended beyond its walls and into the movements of those who used it. The case, which had begun with a question of presence, now pointed towards something more deliberate. The house was not simply visited. It was used in a way that ensured no one could ever prove who had been there. The realization that the house might serve multiple individuals altered the nature of the investigation in a subtle but important way. What had first appeared as an isolated irregularity now suggested a shared understanding, an unspoken agreement that extended beyond a single person and into a pattern of use. The house was no longer simply a place of interest, but a point within a system that had been designed, or at least adopted, for a specific purpose. Edmund Blackwood did not approach this possibility as a matter of speculation, but as a question of consistency. If the house was used by more than one individual, then the manner of its use would reflect that. There would be no personal imprint, no repetition of behavior that could be traced back to a single source. Instead, the space would remain neutral, its condition shaped by brief and varied interactions rather than continuous presence. This was precisely what had been observed. The disturbances within the house lacked direction. They did not form paths, nor did they suggest habitual movement. Each irregularity appeared independent of the others, as though it had been introduced without regard for what had come before or what might follow. This absence of continuity was not accidental. It was the natural result of a space used without ownership. The question that followed was not whether such a system could exist, but how it had been established. There are places in any city that fall into disuse, left behind as patterns of movement shift and change. Most of these remain empty, their neglect gradually increasing until they are either reclaimed or forgotten entirely. For a house to remain in the state observed, however, required a different condition. It required awareness, not only of its existence, but of its availability. Someone had to know the house was there. And more than that, more than one individual had to know that it could be used without interference. This knowledge could not have spread widely without altering the condition of the space. If too many were aware of it, the house would show signs of more frequent use, of disturbance that could no longer be dismissed as incidental. Its current state suggested a limited circle, a group small enough to maintain the balance between use and absence. Edmund's attention shifted at this point from the house itself to its surroundings. The street, though quiet, was not entirely removed from the flow of the city. It connected, through a series of narrower paths, to areas of greater activity, allowing movement to and from the house without drawing attention. These routes, though unremarkable, provided access that was both direct and discreet. It was along these paths that the next detail began to emerge. The ground, where it had not been disturbed by recent weather, carried faint impressions of passage. These were not clear tracks, nor did they form a pattern that could be followed with certainty. Yet they suggested that the street, though seldom used, was not entirely without movement. The impressions varied in depth and direction, reinforcing the idea that more than one individual had passed through, each at a different time. Such movement, while subtle, supported the earlier conclusion. The house was part of a network of quiet paths, locations connected not by formal record, but by shared knowledge. It was a place that could be reached without notice, used without leaving trace, and left without consequence. Its value lay in its anonymity, in the fact that it belonged to no one and therefore to anyone who knew of it. As this understanding took form, the purpose of the house began to reveal itself more clearly. It was not a place where actions originated, nor one where they concluded. It existed between those points, serving as a moment of transition within a larger sequence. It allowed for the separation of events, for the movement from one stage to another without direct connection. This function, while subtle, carried significant implications. A place that allows for separation can be used to obscure relationships between actions. It can break continuity, ensuring that one event does not lead directly to another. In doing so, it creates distance not in space, but in understanding. Edmund Blackwood regarded the house once more not as a structure of wood and stone, but as a point within this broader system. Its condition, its location, and its use all aligned with a purpose that extended beyond its immediate appearance. It was not simply a neglected building, but a tool, shaped not by construction, but by the way it had been used. The case, which had begun with a question of presence, had now shifted towards something more intricate. The house was not important because someone had been inside it. It was important because it allowed someone to pass through it without ever being connected to it. The understanding that the house functioned as a point of transition brought with it a quieter, more deliberate line of inquiry. The question was no longer confined to the structure itself, but extended to the movements that passed through it, to the unseen sequence of actions that began elsewhere, touched this place briefly, and continued beyond it without interruption. The house, in this sense, did not contain events, it separated them. Edmund Blackwood approached this realization with the same restraint that had guided every stage of the investigation. He did not attempt to assign a specific purpose to the house immediately, nor did he assume that its use could be reduced to a single function. Instead, he considered the nature of such a place more broadly, examining what it allowed rather than what it might conceal. A location that leaves no trace of identity offers a particular advantage. It permits actions to occur without continuity, without the gradual accumulation of evidence that would otherwise bind them together. Objects may be brought in and removed, individuals may pass through without remaining, and time itself becomes difficult to measure within its walls. Each visit exists independently, disconnected from those that came before or those that follow. This quality, while subtle, is not without consequence. It allows for the interruption of narrative. In ordinary circumstances, events unfold in a sequence that can be followed, each moment linked to the next through cause and effect. A person leaves one place, arrives at another, and in doing so, creates a path that can be traced. The house disrupted this pattern. It inserted a break into the sequence, a point at which the connection between actions could be obscured or entirely lost. Such a break does not eliminate evidence, but it alters its meaning. An object found in one location may no longer be connected directly to its origin. A person seen entering one place may not be seen leaving it, not because they remain within, but because they exit by a different path, one that does not align with expectation. The continuity that allows for understanding is replaced by uncertainty, and within that uncertainty, explanation becomes more difficult. It was within this framework that Edmund's attention began to settle. The house was not merely used, it was used with purpose. Its condition, carefully maintained between neglect and order, ensured that it would not attract attention. Its location, connected yet discreet, allowed for access without observation. Its interior, devoid of personal markers, prevented any association from forming between those who entered and the space itself. Each of these elements contributed to a single outcome, the preservation of separation. As this understanding deepened, the earlier observations took on new significance. The irregular disturbances, once viewed as isolated inconsistencies, now appeared as evidence of repeated use, each instance brief and controlled. The absence of clear tracks, of defined patterns, reinforced the idea that no single individual dominated the space. Instead, it was shared, not simultaneously, but sequentially, each visit leaving behind only the faintest indication that it had occurred. The implication of this shared use extended beyond convenience. It suggested coordination, not necessarily in the sense of direct communication, but in the form of a shared understanding, an awareness of the house and its function that allowed multiple individuals to rely upon it without interfering with one another. Such understanding does not arise spontaneously. It develops over time, through repetition, through the quiet confirmation that a place remains available and unchanged. Edmund did not speak of this directly, yet his attention moved in a way that made the conclusion difficult to ignore. The house had not been discovered recently, nor had it been adopted by chance. It had been part of a system for some time, used often enough to establish its role, but not so often as to alter its condition. This balance, once recognized, revealed something further. The house was not the only place of its kind. A system that relies on separation rarely depends upon a single point. It extends outward, forming a network of locations, each serving a similar function, each allowing for the interruption of continuity. The house we had observed was one such point, but it was unlikely to be the only one. This realization did not complicate the case so much as it expanded it. The investigation could no longer be confined to a single structure. It required an understanding of the movements that connected such places, of the paths taken between them, and of the individuals who relied upon them. The house, though central to the initial observation, had become part of a larger pattern, one that extended beyond its walls and into the quiet spaces of the city. As I considered this, It became clear that the case was no longer defined by the presence of a light behind a curtain, nor by the suggestion of movement within an empty room. Those had been the first indications, the subtle signs that something did not align with expectation. What they had revealed, however, was far more deliberate. The house was not empty in the way it appeared. It was used in a way that ensured no one could ever prove how often it had been entered, or by whom. The possibility that the house was part of a wider network did not introduce confusion so much as it refined the direction of inquiry. What had once appeared as an isolated peculiarity now suggested a system built upon repetition and restraint, a structure that relied not on visibility, but on consistency over time. The house was no longer an endpoint, but a point of reference, a place through which something passed rather than something that contained it. Edmund Blackwood did not attempt to identify additional locations immediately. Instead, he returned his attention to the existing evidence, examining whether it supported the existence of such a network. It was not enough to assume that similar places existed. There had to be indications, however subtle, that the pattern extended beyond a single instance. The condition of the house itself provided the first confirmation. Its balance between use and neglect was not easily maintained by chance. Too little interaction, and the signs of abandonment would become unmistakable. Too much, and the disturbances would accumulate into something that could no longer be ignored. The state in which the house existed required a degree of control, an understanding of how often it could be used without altering its appearance. Such control implied experience. It suggested that those who used the house had learned, over time, how to preserve its condition, how to move within it without leaving clear trace, and how to depart without drawing attention. This knowledge, once acquired, would not be limited to a single location. It could be applied elsewhere, wherever similar conditions existed. The streets surrounding the house, though quiet, did not exist in isolation. They connected to a broader network of narrow passages and lesser-used routes, forming a web of movement that allowed for discretion without complete removal from the city. These paths, while unremarkable to most, offered a level of continuity that could support repeated use without attracting notice. It was along these routes that Edmund began to observe further detail. The patterns of movement, though faint, suggested that certain paths were favored over others. Not in a way that could be traced directly, but in the subtle consistency of disturbance, in the slight variations in surface that indicated passage over time. These were not the marks of heavy traffic, but of deliberate use, repeated often enough to leave an impression, yet not so frequently as to define a clear path. This balance mirrored that of the house itself. It reinforced the idea that the system extended beyond a single location, that the same principles governing the use of the house applied to the routes that connected it to the rest of the city. Movement was controlled, not in the sense of restriction, but in the sense of awareness. Each step, each passage, occurred within a framework designed to avoid accumulation. The question that followed was not whether other locations existed, but how they were identified. A place such as the house did not reveal its function openly. It required recognition, an understanding of what it offered and how it could be used. This understanding could not be assumed to exist universally. It would be shared among those who had reason to seek such spaces, those whose activities required separation rather than continuity. This suggested a particular kind of association. Not formal, not organized in any visible sense, but defined by shared necessity. Individuals who required such spaces would recognize them, not through instruction, but through familiarity with their characteristics. The house, once identified, would serve as a point within this informal network, available to those who understood its purpose. Edmund did not attempt to define the nature of this association further. It was enough to recognize that it existed and that it influenced the way in which the house was used. The absence of direct connection between those who entered it did not imply isolation, but rather a different form of coordination, one that relied on mutual understanding rather than direct communication. As this perspective settled into place, the earlier observations gained additional clarity. The irregular disturbances, the lack of continuity, and the absence of personal trace were no longer simply characteristics of the house. They were the result of a system designed to prevent such continuity from forming. Each visit, each movement, was part of a larger pattern that ensured no single action could be traced back through the space to its origin. The house did not conceal what occurred within it. It prevented what occurred within it from being connected to anything beyond it. This distinction, though subtle, defined the case more clearly than any single detail. It shifted the focus away from the search for a hidden occupant and toward the understanding of a method, a way of moving through the city that relied on separation rather than concealment. Edmund Blackwood regarded the house once more before we departed, his attention resting not on its surface, but on the role it played within this broader structure. There was no need to remain longer. The house had revealed what it could, not through direct evidence, but through the quiet consistency of its condition. As we stepped back into the street, the impression of the place remained, not as a location of mystery, but as an element within a design that extended far beyond it. The house was not the center of the case. It was only one point within a system that ensured no point would ever appear central. The recognition of a system, once established, changed the way each subsequent detail was understood. What had first appeared as isolated irregularities now aligned with a broader method, one that did not depend on any single location, but on the consistent use of several. The house we had observed was no longer unique in its function, but representative of a pattern that extended beyond immediate view. Edmund Blackwood did not attempt to trace this pattern outward all at once. His method remained focused, returning again to what had already been observed, ensuring that each conclusion could withstand closer examination. The existence of a network suggested coordination, yet the absence of direct evidence required that this coordination be understood in a more subtle way. It was not a matter of organized structure, but of shared practice. Those who used the house did so in a manner that avoided leaving a trace, not because they had been instructed to do so, but because such behavior was necessary for the system to remain effective. The space, once altered beyond a certain point, would lose its value. Its neutrality would be compromised, and with it, the separation it provided. This understanding introduced a further implication. If the house depended on being used carefully, then those who used it must have had reason to preserve it. They were not passing through by chance, nor were they unaware of its condition. Their actions, though brief, were deliberate, guided by the need to maintain the space in a state that allowed for continued use. Such behavior suggests repetition, not in the sense of frequent return to the same location, but in the use of similar locations over time. The individuals involved had likely relied on such spaces before and would do so again, applying the same principles wherever they found them. The house, in this sense, was not an isolated discovery, but part of a learned method. Edmund's attention turned, gradually, to the timing of the observed disturbances. The reports of light, though irregular, were not entirely without pattern. They occurred at intervals that suggested use during the later hours, when the surrounding street was least active. This choice of time aligned with the broader structure of the system, reducing the likelihood of observation while maintaining access to the routes that connected the house to other parts of the city. The brevity of these occurrences was equally significant. The light was never seen for long. It appeared, then disappeared, leaving no opportunity for closer inspection. This suggested that whatever activity took place within the house was completed quickly, without delay, and without unnecessary movement. The space was entered, used, and left in a manner that preserved its condition and avoided attention. Such precision is rarely achieved without prior experience. It reinforced the idea that the individuals involved were not acting independently, but within a framework that had been refined over time. Whether this framework had been developed collectively or adopted individually remained unclear, yet its presence was evident in the consistency of the results. As this understanding deepened, the earlier question of purpose returned with greater clarity. The house allowed for separation, but separation alone does not define its use. It is the nature of what is separated that gives meaning to the system. Objects, actions, identities, each can be divided, relocated, or obscured through the use of such spaces, provided the method is applied with care. Edmund did not define this purpose explicitly, yet his attention moved in a way that suggested a narrowing of possibilities. The system, as it had been observed, aligned most closely with activities that required discretion, that depended on the ability to move without leaving a continuous trace. It was not a system of residence, nor one of storage in the usual sense. It existed to facilitate transition, to allow something to pass from one state to another without direct connection. The house, therefore, was not important for what remained within it, but for what did not remain. It was a place where presence left no memory. As I considered this, the earlier reports of light took on a different meaning. They were not signs of habitation, nor of prolonged activity, but brief indications of use, moments in which the system revealed itself before returning to stillness. Each appearance, though fleeting, confirmed that the house continued to serve its function, that it remained part of a sequence that extended beyond immediate observation. The case, which had begun with uncertainty, had now reached a point where its structure could be understood, though not yet fully revealed. The house, the movements, and the pattern of use all pointed toward a method that relied on absence as much as presence, on what could not be seen as much as on what could. Edmund Blackwood regarded this method without haste, allowing its implications to settle before proceeding further. The house had shown how the system worked. What remained was to determine what, precisely, was moving through it. The question of what moved through the house did not yield an immediate answer, yet it refined the inquiry in a way that narrowed its scope. The system, as it had been understood, existed to separate actions, to interrupt continuity and prevent direct association between one event and the next. Such a method is not applied without purpose, and that purpose, though not yet fully visible, could be approached through the nature of what required such separation. Edmund Blackwood did not attempt to define this purpose through assumption. Instead, he returned once more to the physical details, examining whether they suggested the movement of objects, individuals, or both. The house, though neutral in appearance, had not been entirely untouched. The disturbances, faint as they were, indicated contact, though not of a kind that could be easily categorized. The surfaces bore no marks of heavy handling. There were no signs that large or cumbersome items had been moved through the rooms, no indication of repeated contact with specific objects or areas. The disturbances were too light, too inconsistent to support the idea of storage in the conventional sense. Whatever passed through the house did not remain, nor did it require extended interaction with the space. This suggested movement rather than containment. The absence of personal items reinforced this conclusion. There was nothing within the house that could be linked to identity, no trace that might suggest someone had paused long enough to establish a presence. The space was used briefly, and then left in a condition that obscured the fact that it had been used at all. The timing of these visits, inferred from the reports of light, further supported this understanding. The activity occurred during hours when observation was least likely, and it was carried out quickly, without delay. The house did not serve as a place of gathering, nor as a location for prolonged action. It existed as a point of passage, a moment within a larger sequence that could not be observed directly. Edmund's attention turned, at this stage, to the routes that connected the house to other parts of the city. If something passed through this location, then it must have come from somewhere and gone elsewhere. The paths that led to and from the house, though subtle, provided the only means by which such movement could be traced. These routes, as previously observed, were not random. They followed a pattern of discretion, favoring narrow streets, lesser-used passages, and connections that allowed for movement without interruption. Such paths did not eliminate the possibility of being seen, but they reduced it, aligning with the broader method of avoiding continuity. It was along these routes that a further detail began to emerge. The movement, though controlled, was not entirely without variation. The disturbances, faint as they were, suggested that different individuals had passed through at different times, each following a path that aligned with the same general structure, yet not identical in execution. This variation indicated that the system did not rely on a single route, but on a set of possibilities, each one offering the same advantage of separation. Such flexibility is characteristic of a method rather than a fixed plan. It suggested that the individuals involved were not following a strict sequence, but applying a principle, adapting their movement as required while maintaining the overall structure. The house, in this context, was one point among several, chosen not because it was unique, but because it fulfilled the necessary conditions. As this understanding developed, the nature of what passed through the house became clearer, not in its specifics, but in its requirements. It required discretion, speed, and the ability to remain unconnected to any single location. It did not rely on prolonged presence, nor did it leave behind evidence that could be easily traced. It existed within the gaps between observation, moving from one point to another without forming a continuous path. This description aligned most closely with the movement of individuals rather than objects alone. Objects, particularly those of value or size, tend to leave traces of their passage, whether through weight, handling, or the need for careful placement. The absence of such traces suggested that whatever was being moved did not require such consideration. It could be carried easily, introduced into the space without disruption, and removed without altering the condition of the room. This did not exclude the presence of objects entirely, but it placed greater emphasis on the individuals themselves. The house, therefore, functioned not as a place where things were stored, but as a point through which people passed, each carrying something that did not remain. Their presence was brief, their interaction minimal, and their departure ensured that no clear connection could be drawn between their arrival and their next destination. Edmund Blackwood considered this quietly, allowing the implications to settle without forcing them into immediate conclusion. The system, as it now appeared, was not designed to conceal a single event, but to support repeated movement, each instance separate from the others, yet all following the same underlying principle. The house had revealed how the system worked. Now it began to suggest who it was designed for. Those who could not afford to be seen more than once in the same place. The idea that the house served those who could not afford to be seen more than once in the same place gave the investigation a clearer direction, though it did not immediately reveal its full meaning. Such a need does not arise without reason. It belongs to a particular kind of activity, one that depends upon movement, discretion, and the careful avoidance of repetition. The system, as it had been observed, was not constructed for convenience, but for necessity. Edmund Blackwood did not approach this realization as a conclusion, but as a refinement. The house, the routes, and the pattern of use all suggested a method, yet the nature of what required that method still needed to be understood with greater precision. It was not enough to know that individuals passed through the space. The question was why they did so in this manner, and what they carried with them that could not remain. The earlier observations began to take on new significance when viewed from this perspective. The disturbances within the house, though light, indicated not only movement, but variation. Different individuals had passed through, each leaving behind a trace that did not align with those of the others. This lack of consistency suggested that the system was not limited to a single purpose, but could be applied to a range of activities, each requiring the same essential condition, separation. The absence of direct evidence within the house did not obscure this understanding. On the contrary, it reinforced it. A place that leaves nothing behind does not do so by chance. It does so because what passes through it is not meant to remain, not even in the form of trace or implication. The house was not concealing something. It was ensuring that nothing could be connected through it. As Edmund considered this, his attention returned to the reports that had first drawn notice to the house. The light, seen briefly and without pattern, had been interpreted as a sign of presence. Yet when placed within the broader structure, it suggested something more precise. It marked the moment of use. Each appearance of light corresponded not to habitation, but to activity. It was the only visible indication that the house had been entered, and it lasted only as long as was necessary to complete whatever task had brought someone there. Once that task was finished, the light disappeared, and with it, any sign that the space had been used. This understanding aligned with the brevity of the disturbances observed within the house. The activity was not prolonged, nor did it extend beyond what was required. It was controlled, efficient, and designed to leave as little trace as possible. Such behavior is rarely associated with ordinary movement. It suggests purpose. Edmund Blackwood did not define that purpose explicitly, yet the direction of his attention made it increasingly clear that the system was being used in relation to actions that required careful separation. Not necessarily in isolation, but in sequence, where one stage must not be directly linked to the next. The house, in this context, functioned as a point of transition between stages. An individual might enter carrying something that connected them to one event and leave carrying something that connected them to another. The house, by interrupting the continuity between those states, prevented a direct line from being drawn between them. It allowed for change without connection, for movement without traceable progression. As I considered this, the earlier impressions of the house took on a different quality. It was no longer simply a place that resisted being defined as empty. It was a place that actively prevented definition, not through concealment, but through the absence of continuity. The significance of this became clearer when placed alongside the broader movement within the city. Individuals who rely on such a system do not remain in one place longer than necessary. Their presence is temporary, their movements controlled, and their actions divided into stages that can be separated from one another. The house supported this pattern, not by hiding what occurred within it, but by ensuring that what occurred could not be connected to what came before or after. This method, though subtle, carried a distinct advantage. It did not rely on secrecy alone, but on the fragmentation of information. A witness might observe an individual entering the house, but would not see where they had come from, nor where they went afterward. Another might observe a departure, but without knowledge of the arrival. Each observation, taken alone, would reveal nothing. Only by connecting them could a pattern emerge, and the system was designed precisely to prevent such connection. Edmund did not state this directly, yet his attention had already moved beyond the house itself, toward the movements that surrounded it. The case, which had begun with a question of presence, had now become a question of sequence, of how actions were divided and reassembled in a way that obscured their origin. The house had shown how separation was achieved. What remained was to determine where those separated paths began and where they ultimately led. By this stage, the investigation no longer revolved around the house itself, but around the paths that converged upon it and then diverged again without leaving a visible connection. The structure of the system had revealed how movement was concealed, how presence could be divided into separate moments that resisted being joined together. What remained was to understand where those moments began and where they led once they passed through the space that interrupted them. Edmund Blackwood approached this final shift in focus with the same restraint that had guided every previous step. He did not seek to follow any single path directly, nor did he assume that the origin of the movements could be identified through immediate observation. Instead, he returned once more to the fragments that had already been gathered, allowing them to suggest direction without forcing them into conclusion. The reports of light, brief and irregular, had marked the times at which the house had been used. When considered together, they suggested a pattern not of frequency, but of distribution. The appearances were not clustered, nor were they evenly spaced. They occurred at intervals that aligned with the quieter hours of the night, when the surrounding streets were least observed and movement could take place without interruption. This alignment was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate choice, one that ensured the system operated within conditions that favored its purpose. The timing of each visit reduced the likelihood of witness, while the brevity of the activity limited the chance of interruption. The house was entered only when it could be used without drawing attention and left before any attention could gather. The routes that connected the house to the rest of the city followed a similar logic. They did not lead directly to the busiest areas, nor did they avoid them entirely. Instead, they moved along the edges, through spaces that allowed for transition without concentration. These were not hidden paths, but they were not obvious ones either. They existed in that intermediate space where movement could occur without becoming noticeable. It was along these routes that Edmund began to observe a further detail. The movement, though controlled, showed signs of convergence. Not in the sense of individuals gathering, but in the repetition of certain points, places where paths intersected briefly before separating again. These intersections were not marked in any visible way, yet they appeared in the pattern of disturbance, in the subtle indications that different movements had passed through the same location at different times. Such convergence suggested origin. A system that separates actions must, at some point, begin from a place where those actions are connected. The house did not serve this function. It divided, it interrupted, but it did not initiate. There had to be another point, one that preceded the house, where the sequence began before being broken apart. Edmund did not attempt to identify this point immediately, yet the direction of his attention made it clear that it existed. The pattern of movement, once followed backward, began to narrow. The routes that had appeared varied when viewed from the house began to align as they extended further into the city. The variation diminished, the paths converged, and the movement, though still discrete, became more focused. This focus suggested a place of origin. Not a single location in the conventional sense, but a point within the city where the system began its sequence before dispersing into separate paths. Such a place would not necessarily reveal itself through obvious activity. On the contrary, it would likely appear ordinary, its significance concealed within the routine of daily movement. The house, in this context, had served as the visible anomaly, the point at which the system could be observed precisely because it interrupted expectation. The origin, by contrast, would align with expectation, blending into the surrounding environment in a way that prevented it from standing apart. This distinction, once understood, shifted the nature of the search. The investigation was no longer directed toward what appeared unusual, but toward what appeared too ordinary to attract attention. The origin would not reveal itself through irregularity, but through consistency, through its alignment with the patterns of the city rather than its deviation from them. Edmund Blackwood considered this without haste, allowing the implications to settle before proceeding further. The case had moved beyond the question of how the system functioned, and now approached the question of where it began. The house had shown how movement could be separated. Now it pointed, quietly and indirectly, toward the place where that movement was first set into motion. The shift toward identifying the origin of the movement required a different kind of attention, one less focused on irregularities and more attuned to what remained consistently unremarkable. The system, as it had been understood, relied on blending into the ordinary, on moving within patterns that did not invite scrutiny. The point from which it began would therefore not stand apart, but exist within the city's routine, indistinguishable at first glance from the countless other places that formed its daily structure. Edmund Blackwood approached this stage with a quiet patience, allowing the previously observed routes to guide his consideration. When followed in reverse, these paths did not lead immediately to a single location, but they began, gradually, to align. The variation that had characterized movement near the house diminished as the paths extended outward, converging toward an area where activity was neither excessive nor absent, but steady in a way that resisted attention. This area did not distinguish itself through appearance. Its buildings, its streets, and the movement within them all reflected the ordinary rhythm of the city. There were shops, small warehouses, and places of routine business, each contributing to a pattern of activity that, while constant, did not draw notice. It was precisely this quality that made it suitable. A place that is always in motion is difficult to observe. Within such an environment, individual movements are absorbed into the whole, their significance lost within the larger pattern. An arrival does not stand out, a departure does not linger, and the connection between them is easily overlooked. It is within such conditions that a sequence can begin without being recognized. The convergence of paths suggested that the origin of the system lay within this ordinary setting, not in a location that announced itself, but in one that remained indistinguishable from those around it. The movement that passed through the house did not begin there. It began here, within a space that allowed for initial connection before that connection was deliberately broken. Edmund did not isolate a single building immediately. Instead, he observed the movement within the area, noting where patterns of activity aligned too closely with the structure that had already been identified. There were places where individuals entered and left without remaining, where the duration of presence was brief and the purpose not immediately apparent. Such behavior, while not uncommon in itself, took on greater significance when viewed in relation to the system as a whole. Among these, one location began to stand apart, not through its appearance, but through the consistency of its use. It was a modest establishment, one that did not invite particular attention. Its function on the surface was ordinary, and its presence within the street did not disrupt the surrounding pattern. Yet the movement associated with it reflected the same characteristics observed in the house, though in reverse. Individuals entered in a manner that suggested purpose, and left in a way that aligned with the dispersed routes that led toward the point of separation. This alignment could not be dismissed. It suggested that the location served as the beginning of the sequence, the place where actions were first set into motion before being divided and obscured through the use of transitional spaces. The house, then, was not an endpoint, nor a destination, but an intermediate stage within a larger process. The significance of this realization lay not in the identification of the location itself, but in the relationship between it and the house. The two were connected not by direct path, but by pattern. One initiated movement, the other interrupted it. Between them lay a sequence that could not be easily reconstructed without recognizing the structure that bound them together. Each stage existed independently, yet each depended upon the others to achieve its purpose. Edmund Blackwood regarded this connection with the same measured clarity that had guided the investigation from the beginning. There was no need to impose further explanation upon it. The pattern had revealed itself, and within it, the roles of each location had become clear. The case, which had begun with the suggestion of presence within an empty house, had now extended outward to reveal a system that relied on absence, on the deliberate breaking of continuity that prevented events from being connected. The house had shown where movement was divided. This new location revealed where that movement began. And between the two, the structure of the system stood complete, each part defined not by what it contained, but by the role it played in ensuring that no single path could be followed from beginning to end. The recognition of an origin did not simplify the case so much as it deepened it. What had once been a matter of isolated observation had become a structure that extended across the city, linking places not through direct paths, but through a method that ensured those paths could not be easily followed. The house had revealed how movement was divided. The newly observed location suggested where that movement began. Between them lay a sequence that, if understood correctly, would explain not only the function of the system, but the intention behind it. Edmund Blackwood did not attempt to approach the origin directly. To do so would have risked disrupting the very pattern he sought to understand. Instead, he observed it as he had observed the house, from a position that allowed for attention without interference. The movement within the area, though ordinary at first glance, began to reveal its structure when considered over time rather than in isolated moments. Individuals entered and left with a regularity that did not correspond to the visible purpose of the place. Their presence was brief, their movement controlled, and their interactions minimal. There was no indication of prolonged activity, no sign that anyone remained beyond what was necessary. This alone would not have been unusual, yet when placed alongside the pattern already established, it took on a different significance. The timing of these movements aligned with the earlier observations made at the house. Those who entered did so at intervals that suggested coordination, though not in the sense of direct communication. There were gaps between arrivals, moments of stillness that allowed the space to return to its ordinary state before being used again. This rhythm, subtle as it was, ensured that no accumulation of presence could form, no continuity that might draw attention. The location itself contributed to this effect. Its function, though outwardly clear, provided a constant flow of activity that masked the movements occurring within it. Individuals came and went for reasons that appeared legitimate, their presence absorbed into the broader pattern of the place. Within such an environment, even deliberate movement could pass without notice, provided it did not deviate from expectation. Edmund's attention rested not on any single individual, but on the relation between them. The sequence of arrivals and departures, when observed over time, revealed a structure that mirrored the one already identified at the house, though in reverse. Here, movement converged rather than dispersed. Individuals arrived from different directions, entered briefly, and then departed along paths that led toward the point of separation. This alignment confirmed what had been suggested earlier. The location functioned as the beginning of the sequence. It was here that actions were initiated, that connections existed before being deliberately broken. The house, by contrast, served to interrupt those connections, ensuring that what began here could not be traced back through it. The implications of this structure extended beyond the individual locations. It revealed a method of operation that relied on fragmentation. An action initiated at the origin would be divided into stages, each one carried out in a different place, each separated from the others by the use of transitional spaces. No single location would contain enough information to reveal the whole. Each would hold only a fragment, insufficient on its own to form a complete understanding. This method, though complex in appearance, was simple in principle. It prevented continuity. Without continuity, there could be no direct path from cause to effect, no clear line that connected one event to another. The investigation, when confined to a single location, would encounter only fragments, each one incomplete, each one resistant to interpretation. The house had been one such fragment. The origin, now observed, was another. Between them lay a sequence that could not be fully reconstructed without recognizing the pattern that bound them together. Each stage existed independently, yet each depended upon the others to achieve its purpose. Edmund Blackwood regarded this structure with quiet attention, allowing its implications to settle without forcing them into immediate conclusion. The case had reached a point where the method was understood, where the function of each location could be defined within the broader system. What remained was not the discovery of new elements, but the confirmation of the connection between them. The origin and the point of separation were linked not by visible trace, but by pattern. And within that pattern, there remained a final detail, one that would move the case from understanding to resolution, not by introducing something new, but by revealing what had been present from the beginning. The system, though designed to prevent connection, could not entirely eliminate it. Somewhere within the sequence, there existed a point where the separation was incomplete, where the pattern, however briefly, allowed for recognition. And it was toward this point that Edmund's attention now turned, not in haste, but with the same measured certainty that had guided every step of the investigation. The case no longer asked how the system functioned. It asked where it failed. The recognition that the system must, at some point, fail did not suggest a flaw in its design, but rather an inevitability within its execution. No method, however carefully constructed, can eliminate every connection. It can obscure, divide, and delay, yet it must still operate within the constraints of time, space, and movement. It is within these constraints that a pattern, however subtle, begins to reveal itself. Edmund Blackwood approached this final stage with a renewed attention to what had already been observed, not seeking new evidence, but re-examining the existing structure for points of tension. The origin and the house, though separated by purpose, were connected by necessity. Movement flowed between them, even if that movement could not be traced directly. Somewhere within that flow, there had to be a moment where the separation was incomplete, where one stage overlapped with another just enough to leave a trace. This trace would not be obvious. It would not present itself as a contradiction, but as a detail that did not fully align with the rest. A deviation not in appearance, but in timing, in the relation between one action and the next. The system depended upon intervals, upon the careful spacing of movement to prevent accumulation. If those intervals were altered even slightly, the separation would weaken. It was in the timing of the observed activity that Edmund found the first indication. The reports of light at the house, when arranged in sequence, did not form a perfect distribution. There were moments where the intervals shortened, where activity occurred closer together than the pattern would suggest. These moments, though rare, introduced a subtle inconsistency, one that could not be explained by chance alone. Such compression of time suggested urgency. An instance in which the system had been used more rapidly than intended, reducing the space between stages and increasing the risk of overlap. Under such conditions, the separation that normally prevented connection could become incomplete, allowing for a fragment of continuity to remain. Edmund did not treat this as a deviation from the pattern, but as part of it. A system that operates repeatedly will, at times, encounter variation. These variations, while not frequent, are inevitable, and it is within them that the structure becomes visible. The moments where the method is applied under less controlled conditions reveal more than those where it functions as intended. Attention turned once more to the origin. If the intervals between movements had shortened, then the activity at the origin would reflect this change. The sequence of arrivals and departures, when observed over the same period, began to show a similar compression. Individuals entered and left with less time between them, their movements overlapping just enough to suggest that the system had been under pressure. This alignment confirmed the connection. The variation observed at the house was not isolated. It corresponded to a change in the pattern at the origin, indicating that both were part of the same sequence, affected by the same condition. The system, though intact, had been used in a way that brought its stages closer together than intended. This introduced a critical detail. In moments of overlap, the separation between stages becomes incomplete. An individual leaving the origin might still be connected, however briefly, to the action that preceded their departure. If they passed through the house within a reduced interval, the interruption would not fully dissolve that connection. A trace, faint but present, would remain. Edmund Blackwood considered this without haste, allowing the implications to settle before proceeding further. The case had reached a point where the method could be understood not only in its ideal form, but in its variation. The system, though designed to prevent continuity, could not entirely eliminate it under all conditions. The question then became one of identification. If a trace remained, however slight, it could be observed. Not through direct evidence, but through the alignment of movement, timing, and pattern. The individuals involved, though careful, could not avoid these moments of compression entirely. And within those moments, their actions would reveal a connection that could be followed. As I reflected upon this, it became clear that the case had shifted once more, from understanding the system to observing its limitation. The house, the origin, and the paths between them had revealed how separation was achieved. Now they began to show where it could not be perfectly maintained. The system did not fail in a visible way. It failed in the smallest possible measure, in the narrowing of intervals, in the quiet overlap of movement that left behind just enough continuity to be recognized. And it was within that narrow space, between intention and execution, that the final resolution of the case would be found. The narrowing of intervals, once identified, altered the tone of the investigation without altering its pace. There was no sudden revelation, no abrupt shift in direction. Instead, there was a gradual refinement of focus, a quiet turning of attention toward those moments when the system, under pressure, revealed more than it intended. Edmund Blackwood did not seek to expose the method directly. To do so would have required interruption, and interruption would have restored the system's natural caution. Instead, he observed the rhythm of movement over several nights, allowing the pattern to unfold in its ordinary state, waiting for the subtle compression that had been noted before. It did not take long. The convergence at the origin, normally spaced with careful restraint, began once again to tighten. Arrivals followed one another more closely than the established rhythm suggested they should. Departures overlapped in a way that, though still discrete, reduced the separation between stages. The movement did not become chaotic, it simply became hurried. Such haste, even when controlled, leaves behind something that patience would conceal. The house reflected this shift as well. The reports of light, once separated by comfortable intervals, appeared closer together. The duration of illumination remained brief, yet its recurrence suggested that the system was being used with greater frequency than intended. The balance between use and invisibility had begun, ever so slightly, to tilt. It was within this compression that Edmund found the final alignment. One evening, as the sequence repeated itself with reduced intervals, the departure from the origin and the use of the house occurred within a span too narrow to dissolve continuity entirely. The separation, though present, was incomplete. Movement that should have appeared unrelated carried with it a faint echo of its origin, a subtle consistency that revealed connection rather than division. This echo was not a visible mark, nor a physical trace left within the house. It was found in timing and direction, in the relation between one path and the next. The individual who left the origin during this compressed interval followed a route that aligned too precisely with the pattern already observed. The movement toward the house was not random, nor was it one among many equally plausible options. It fit within the structure so exactly that it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Edmund did not intervene immediately. Instead, he allowed the pattern to complete itself, observing the use of the house and the subsequent departure along a dispersed path. The sequence, though compressed, remained intact. Yet the compression had done what it always does under pressure. It had reduced the margin within which separation could operate. The system had not collapsed. It had revealed itself. The connection between the origin and the house, once theoretical, now stood confirmed through alignment rather than assumption. The narrowing of intervals had exposed the continuity that the method sought to prevent. In its effort to maintain efficiency, the system had sacrificed just enough separation to allow recognition. Edmund Blackwood regarded this outcome without triumph. There was no dramatic unveiling, no declaration that the method had been undone. Instead, there was the quiet certainty that the structure was now complete, understood in both its strength and its limitation. The house, once an enigma defined by absence, had become a visible stage within a sequence that extended beyond it. The origin, once indistinguishable within the city's ordinary movement, had revealed its role through the convergence of paths. And between them, the compressed interval had bridged what the system was designed to divide. As I considered the full arc of the case, I was struck by how little had been hidden in the conventional sense. Nothing within the house had been concealed behind secret compartments or deliberate deception. Nothing at the origin had stood apart as suspicious. The system relied not on secrecy, but on fragmentation, on the belief that separation alone would prevent understanding. It had nearly succeeded. Under ordinary conditions, the intervals would have remained wide enough to dissolve continuity completely. Each stage would have appeared isolated, each location unrelated to the next. The pattern would have persisted indefinitely, sustained by restraint and careful timing. But pressure had altered the rhythm, and in that alteration, the continuity re-emerged. The case, which had begun with the suggestion that an empty house was not truly empty, had unfolded into something far more deliberate. It was not the presence within the house that mattered, but the movement that passed through it. The house was never meant to contain life. It was meant to contain nothing at all, to absorb connection and return only silence. Yet silence, when compressed, can begin to echo. And it was in that faint echo, carried across narrowing intervals and aligned paths, that the system was finally understood, not as an unbreakable design, but as one dependent upon the very timing that ultimately revealed it. By the time the structure of the system stood fully revealed, there was no need for spectacle. Nothing dramatic marked its conclusion. The house remained as it had always been, quiet and unremarkable among the others on its street. The origin continued to function within the ordinary rhythm of the city, absorbing arrivals and releasing departures without drawing attention. And yet, the invisible line that once ran between them, broken and concealed, now lay clearly understood. Edmund Blackwood did not approach the resolution of the case as an act of exposure, but as an act of confirmation. The system had relied on fragmentation, on the careful separation of stages so that no single observer could follow a path from beginning to end. Once the compression of intervals had revealed the continuity beneath that separation, the method no longer possessed the protection it once had. The strength of the design had always depended upon patience. When that patience faltered even slightly, the structure began to show its seams. The narrowing of time between movements had allowed the echo of origin to remain audible within the house. What was once divided had, for a brief moment, overlapped. And that overlap was enough. The individuals who relied upon the system may never have considered the possibility that pressure alone could expose them. Their method did not depend on hidden doors or secret signals, but on rhythm, on the careful spacing of actions that prevented them from forming a single narrative. It was a subtle approach, elegant in its simplicity, and for a time it had functioned without disruption. Yet no rhythm remains perfect under strain. The case, when viewed in its entirety, was not about a haunted house or a mysterious light behind drawn curtains. It was about the manipulation of sequence. It was about the deliberate interruption of continuity, about ensuring that what began in one place could not be traced through another. The house had never been meant to hold secrets, it had been meant to dissolve them. And for many nights, it had done exactly that. As I reflect upon those quiet streets and the rooms that seemed so still, I am reminded that absence can be as deliberate as presence. The dust upon the floor, the faint disturbance along a surface, the brief glow of light against a curtain, none of these were accidental. Each was a fragment, too small to mean anything alone, yet together they formed the outline of something carefully arranged. Edmund, or Blackwood as many would later refer to him in accounts of his work, did not dwell on the elegance of the system he had uncovered. His attention had already begun to withdraw from it, not in dismissal, but in accordance with his nature. Once a pattern revealed itself fully, it no longer required his focus. The case, in his mind, had reached its natural conclusion the moment the continuity reappeared. For myself, the lasting impression was quieter. The house still stands, its windows reflecting the same muted light, its door closed against the street as though nothing had ever passed through it. To any passerby, it remains what it always seemed to be, empty. And in a sense, it is. No one resides there, no life lingers within its walls. Yet it will always hold the memory of movement, of separation and convergence, of a system that sought to erase its own narrative. It is a reminder that what appears vacant may, in truth, be carefully used. That silence may conceal rhythm, and that even the most deliberate fragmentation cannot entirely prevent connection. The city continues, its streets absorbing countless footsteps, its buildings holding more stories than they reveal. Somewhere, perhaps, another space exists between presence and absence, waiting to be understood. But for now, this account reaches its end, the pattern complete and the echo resolved. If you have followed this quiet investigation to its conclusion, allow yourself a moment of stillness. There will always be another case, another subtle anomaly waiting beneath the ordinary. And when it appears, I will once again record the careful work of Edmund Blackwood, whose patience reminds us that even in the quietest places, the truth is never entirely absent. Until then, let the night settle, and let the silence remain what it was always meant to be, not emptiness, but space between moments.